The first time people told me to run for this office, the first thing I said was, hell no. I said, I'm not running for Congress. I had a lot of, what my opponents in the primary said about me, I had a lot of that internalized. And y'all know how it is. Sometimes you internalize what is said about you in your community.
What did I say to you?
You said run for city council.
I said, hell no, run for city council.
Yeah.
I'm supporting Randy Bracey on this one. You were just born.
Yeah.
So I wasn't a believer that it was the right time, but you stuck to what you believed was the possible, and it came true. And I think that is why I'm supporting you now, because I think we have an inside voice, and I'm one of the most hopeful when it comes to young Black talent. But I'm not 25 years old like you, so I see the world in a fundamentally different way. And some of that in our generation is you kind of got to wait in line, right? And what you did was you just designed your own steps and built your own ladder and climbed up there. So we're going to go ahead and begin our conversation with our guest, Maxwell Frost, candidate for 10th District, Congressional District here in Florida, a community activist. I won't say a former community activist. He's still a community activist. That's the activism that's going to bring him to Congress, the activism we want him to kind of stay in full mode on. But also someone who has worked in the community on a variety of different issues, from working with the ACLU, being a Black Lives Matter organizer, really a young man that has a real keen level of natural intelligence. The Stono Institute is nonpartisan. We're not interested in the politics of a candidate, but really the personal character of a candidate. And so we wanted to host a different kind of conversation. Maxwell Frost would be, I believe, the first Z generation member of the United States Congress. And what's interesting about that is he also brings with him a very diverse cultural background. So in the period that we're in now, there are a variety of issues. There's intersectionality in the relationships between groups of people at a time when we've been more divided than ever. And so he brings a perspective from a generation that I think is refreshing and will be useful, not just for the United States Congress and this community, but I think the nation as a whole. And so I want to welcome you, Max, and tell you that I'm pleased that you're here. And I want to just jump into conversation. This is, the venue here is just for us to have a conversation. We'll talk about some politics, but I want everyone to get a sense of your background, the unique background that you in fact have, and speak about that. And as you speak about it, do some cultural reflection, meaning that the parts and parcel that is you, what does that actually mean, right? So who are you in that context, and what does that mean?
First off, thank you so much, Dr. Levin, for hosting this. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for taking the time. My name is Maxwell Alejandro Frost, born and raised here in Central Florida, in Orlando, Florida. And I always like to start with talking about kind of how I got involved in politics. As an organizer, I think our story of self is the greatest tool that we have. I really believe that stories is how we won this primary and how we're going to win this general in a few days. And I just carry my story everywhere I go. So I started in this fight 10 years ago. I went to the Osceola County School for the Arts for 7 years, that's right next to Gatorland and Tupperware, for those of you in Central Florida. I studied jazz drums. I came up, my father's a musician. He's the first, was in the first graduating class, master's degree in studio writing composition from the University of Miami. So I grew up listening to John Coltrane, Stevie Wonder, and the Beach Boys, and Bach, and just all different types of music. And so the arts came very naturally to me. Ended up going to the School for the Arts to study jazz drums, played in the big band for all 7 years. And before every jazz band concert, my best friends and I would go across the street to this, I think it was a Fridays or a macaroni grill. And we would just load up on a ton of junk food. And it wasn't the wisest decision before a show, but it was tradition. And I remember we're there eating, and there was kind of a silence that fell across the entire restaurant. We looked around, looked up at the television screens, and saw that somebody walked into the elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, and murdered 20 children and 6 teachers. And this had a big impact on me. You know, I was 15 years old. I couldn't play right at the show that night. I remember I kept looking at the exits, thinking, could the same thing happen now? Went to the memorial for the families in DC, and found myself sitting across from a guy named Matthew Soto. His sister Vicky was a teacher at Sandy Hook. When she heard the gunshots, she hid the children in the closet and cabinets to save their lives, but she was murdered. And look, just seeing a kid like Matthew, he was 16 at the time. I mean, seeing a 16-year-old with the demeanor of a 60-year-old crying over his sister was murdered for just going to class, it changed my life. It was my call to action. I went straight to my hotel room. I called my mother. She's a teacher of 30 years. She retires this year. I thought about her, thought about my little sister, and dedicated the rest of my life to fighting for a world where no one would have to feel the pain I saw in Matthew's eyes. We had a real connection. And y'all know how it is. You get in for one reason, and you find out that there's a lot of problems, right? But for every problem, there's multiple solutions. For every solution, there's countless people doing the work. That's what's kept me into politics. And I kept organizing in high school. My whole life, I've been about crazy ideas. I was always the kid that always had these crazy ideas and always trying to make them happen. Ran for student government president at my high school, did that for 2 years. I sat on the school board of Osceola County as a student representative for 2 years because I really felt like we needed a student voice on the school board. And after that, just started working full time in campaigns. I packed up my bags, went to Fort Myers to work for a presidential campaign, lived in a trailer with some random lady I never met. That's the campaign life, supporter housing. And from there, never stopped working. Worked on about 6 different campaigns across the state and country. Ended up working at the ACLU, leading their field program for Amendment 4. And then after that, getting hired by the National ACLU to run a program called Rights for All, where we were getting presidential candidates on the record on civil rights and liberties. So if folks don't remember, a few years ago, Joe Biden was under a lot of heat, the president, for his support of the Hyde Amendment, because of a video that came out of him talking about it. I was actually recording the video. It was me and a volunteer that kind of stalked him out at a rally to get his answer on it. But that was kind of the work we were doing. And more recently was a national organizing director at March for Our Lives, the movement that came out of the shooting that happened in Parkland. Our main thing was working on expanding the scope of what gun violence prevention is and the way people think of the solutions to it. And that was, you know, I was really proud of that work. And then decided to run for Congress. And this is where we get into kind of my identity and who I am. I was asked to run by some of the people that Dr. Levitt, you know, and some of the people I marched with during the Black Lives Matter uprisings. 2 summers ago, where, I mean, I would work at my nonprofit job 9 to 5 on Zoom. I'd grab my book bag and hit the streets and be out till 1, 2 a.m. sometimes. Found myself being tear gassed, being maced, getting arrested, going to jail. For me, that experience was important because it really reaffirmed my belief in the fact that we need to reimagine what public safety means in this country. And the fact that we need to work towards a place where people are not criminalized because of the color of the skin or because of the amount of money they have in the bank.
The identity piece is important. And it's important now, and it will be more important 15 years from now. When they look back at this recording, I want people to know your ethnic identity and your background, because people like you and I often are slotted as racially ambiguous. Right? Or we're something, but people can't quite tell, which means we're kind of all things to all people, which is not a bad thing. But give us some specifics about your backgrounds. I don't think people really know that. And what that means for politics is important.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I definitely have a sense of ambiguity to me at points. I even know my own background. So I was adopted at birth. My biological mother is Lebanese and Puerto Rican. My biological father is Haitian, full Haitian. My mother and father who adopted me, I don't call them my adopted parents because they're my parents. They adopted me at birth. So my mother is Cuban. She came here from Cuba in the late 1960s, when she was about, I think, 14. And my father, who adopted me, is a white man from Kansas who was raised in Bermuda because his father was in the Air Force. So my dad is a full-time pan player. He's a steel pan player. That's what he does for work. So I have I have an interesting, got a lot going on there. The way that I was raised was as a Cuban, as a Cubano, right? Going to Hialeah almost every weekend to spend time with my Cuban family. For me, I didn't really step into and understand my Blackness until later in middle school and even early in high school. Being in elementary school, I had a lot of anti-Blackness internalized within me. And there's a lot of anti-Blackness within the Hispanic culture and within Cuban culture, even though like 50% of Cuba are Black people. But either way, for me, I had that internalized. I remember I was just talking with someone in an interview about this the other day. I remember being in elementary school when people would say Max is Black, I would correct them and say, no, 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 I'm brown. And that's that anti-Blackness that I had in me. And for me, being in middle school and high school and really having deep friendships with Black friends and getting to understand Black American culture, but not just Black American culture, Black American youth culture, Gen Z, really is what confronted me with the anti-Blackness I had internalized throughout my life, what that meant for me, how that was directly the antithesis of the music that my father and I grew up, listening to with my father, especially as a jazz musician. And that it was the perfect storm, right, of being so involved in the music, which is Black American music, from jazz and funk and stuff like that, and what I was playing, but also with my personal relationships. And that's before I really even got into politics. It was really all identity based, and really the art and culture helped me understand and confront what it meant to be Black, and what that meant for me. And that started that journey for me that lasted years, and in many cases is still going on, right? So
would you identify as a Black American? How do you self-identify today?
I self-identify as a Black Cuban, Afro Latino. I used to just say Afro Latino, but it seems like a lot of people don't know what that means right now. So I just say Black Latino, so people understand that I am Black, I am also Latino, and the Latino part is in my blood, but also that's how I was raised, and then obviously, so yeah.
Let's go back to 2021 for a second. 2021, you reconnect with your biological mother. Now, I'm asking you this question partly out of curiosity and partly out of having had the same experience. At the age of 22, I reconnected with my biological mother, right? It was quite an experience. What was that experience like for you? How did that happen?
So it's a pretty wild story, but what happened is I was considering running for this office, and I was very divided. And I grew up Southern Baptist, so I felt like one night I just felt something in my heart, almost spiritual, that pushed me to learn more about my story. I never knew anything about my biological parents or my story. Everything I just told y'all about my biological parents and everything I'm about to say, I learned in June of last year. I never wanted to know. My parents always offered to tell me, even when I think at 9 years old, my parents said, I always knew I was adopted. I was the only Black person in my family, but except for my grandpa, my mom who adopted me, her father is black Cuban. But either way, I was really the only Black person in my family, so I always knew, but I never cared. I used to go to these adoptive support groups and could never connect with the other people there because they had been through the foster care system and they had just different views on their parents than I did. My parents are all I ever knew. I never really, hated them to the point where I wanted to seek out my biological family, and I was never curious. But now I wanted to know. So I sat down, with my parents. They told me the story, and they told me her name. And I went on Facebook and I found her, and I was looking through the pages, and I saw we had one mutual friend. And I looked at the mutual friend, and it's my barber, Chris, who's been cutting my hair for over a decade. Mm-hmm. And so I call Chris, or I text Chris, and I say, Chris, do you know who? And I say her name is, and I go, do you know who that is? And he calls me, and we start talking, and he goes, how do you know her? And I go, I just found out that's my biological mother. And then there was kind of a silence. And then he goes, bro, I know your mom. We used to live together as friends right out of high school.
Wow.
When I was working for Amendment 4, part of the reason I decided to do it and part of like getting into it was the fact that Chris, when he was 18, made a mistake, lost his right to vote, and has never been able to vote, but he's always been very politically active. And so knowing someone directly, it was always a driving factor for me in my work. And he told me, Max, you know how I made that mistake when I was 18? He said, I was holding up a store to pay your mom's rent. And it was a lot hearing that from him. And then he said, I have her cell phone number. I can talk to her. And if you want to talk to her, I can give it to you and y'all can chat. So my barber gave me the cell phone number, and he said, you can call her whenever you want. She's ready. I called her. We spoke for a long time about her life, my life. She long story short, she described a situation in which I was like the 8th kid, right? I have 7 siblings, minimum from my mom's side. And found out that, she wasn't in a place to have me and make sure I had a good life. She didn't have any money. She didn't have healthcare. So she never went to the doctor when I was in the womb. And she was just in this cycle as a woman of color of poverty and crime around her and being in that life. And she didn't want that for me. So through a friend, she found out that my mom was looking to adopt, and they went to a dinner and they decided there. And that's how it happened. I was adopted at birth.
That's amazing, right? It's also amazing when you get that spiritual call, when that discernment comes in place and you decide that no mountain ahead of you is going to stop you and you're going to get the answers that you now want.
Yeah.
The kind of illumination that can happen in the heart, because it does in many ways give you a sense of fullness. It helps complete part of the circle of life questions that you'll have. And going forward, it's an important thing for you to know, particularly running for office. So have you met your brothers and sisters from your mother? And what was that like, if you have?
So I haven't. About midway through the campaign, she texted me and said, hey, I told your brothers and sisters about our conversation. They're really excited to meet you. And, and at the time, like, this is mid-campaign. This campaign is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I faced houselessness. I faced not having money to pay my food during this campaign. And when she texted me, this was at the height of my financial troubles personally. So there was a lot going on. My grandma started to die at that time as well. And so I had spoken with my girlfriend, and we, she had given me some advice and said, look, it's okay to say, can we do this later? And that was really good advice, because I'm kind of a guy where I never want to let anyone down. And I'm always worried about hurting people's feelings, right? And I always want people to know I value them and I care about them. But my girlfriend saying that really helped me. So I asked my biological mother, I said, there's so much going on right now. We haven't even met in person yet either. We're setting that up right now. And I said, do you mind if we do this next year? After I have some stability in my life. And she completely understood. So I'm taking it very slowly. Again, I haven't seen my biological mother in person yet. We text and we talk, but we're setting up a dinner that we'll do probably in December. And then I assume midway through next year, after I have a flow in Congress, if I have the honor of being elected in a few days, then I think I'll have a dinner with some of my siblings. And a lot of them are actually here in Central Florida.
Well, I'm going to recommend that you watch a movie before you do any of it called Antoine Fisher.
Antoine Fisher? Okay.
Antoine Fisher. Watch that movie before you reconnect, because you're in for an Antoine Fisher experience at some point. And so it would be an interesting, piece of cinema to take a look at. So that's a great background. I know you've been involved with driving an Uber and to pay the bills, and you're running as a poor congressional candidate, which I love. We have too many millionaires running for political office who don't know what it's like to go without a meal or a house over a roof over their head. You're a survivor of gun violence. And both you and I are passionate about gun violence, but we're on two different ends of the spectrum in terms of the Second Amendment in some ways. It's one thing to talk about the Second Amendment in political terms, but let's talk about gun violence and just for a minute and talk about your experience.
Yeah. So, I'd gotten involved in the fight to end gun violence at 15. 3 years, I think 3 or 4 years later, Pulse would happen. And directly about a couple months after Pulse in October, I was in downtown Orlando with some friends for Halloween. And we were, it was the Halloween block party downtown. We were just having a good time. I remember I dressed up as Chance the Rapper that year. And we were out on the streets, and right next to me there were two dudes arguing over, I think, a girl, because I kind of overheard the conversation. One of them had a gun, pulled it out, and started shooting at the other guy, and started shooting. And I just remember seeing the onslaught of people. I think it was about, I would say, over 100 people sprinting towards the parking garages, me included. One of my best friends fell on the floor and she was like shaking because, sometimes you go into shock. This is just a couple months after Pulse. We had to pick her up and kind of drag her over. And just, that experience of running, not knowing where the gunshot, where the bullets are going, not knowing what's going on, fearing for your life. Really had a big impact on me. But, to be honest, it didn't have the big impact on me until I reflected on the situation, because gun violence has been so normalized. We ran back to our car. We got in there. We're like looking at each other. We're trying to process. And then I don't want to say we shrugged it off, but we kind of moved on. And it wasn't until I was in a roundtable a couple of years later that was a survivors roundtable, and I was there actually as a staff member. I didn't count myself as a survivor of gun violence at that point, because I've met people who've been shot in the head and survived, right? And I think sometimes we play this kind of oppressive Olympics in our mind where we categorize things, and I just didn't think I was that. But I remember sitting there with survivors and people who were in a school classroom when a school shooting happened, but maybe they weren't in the classroom where people were killed. I was in a room with people who had survived multiple drive-by shootings in their neighborhood, but maybe they weren't the target. And what I learned there is gun violence is such a broad issue. It impacts people in a different way, and more people are survivors of gun violence than we think. I mean, there are so many people who are surviving gun violence in their neighborhoods, especially in Black and brown communities, on a daily basis. And so,
we call that where I come from, Max.
What do you call
I can't tell you, growing up in LA, the number of shootings and murders and violence, and I see some people on this line, Dr. Whitaker as well, that we just call lucky. We didn't have the vocabulary, to say a survivor of gun violence, because that would be, 50% of the city. But I think what I like about that term and the way that you phrase it is that I think there are a lot of us that suffer from PTSD and it's undiagnosed. And so I think there's a broader problem here that we have to look at. Having lived in countries where the police don't carry guns, where the civilian population don't really have guns, there's a different civility in the culture, quite frankly, that we don't have here based on our tradition. So I like the way that you phrase that, and I'm wondering. I know some of the advocacy you do around these issues, but let me now take a step back and go into what I would call a Marcus Garvey, Huey P. Newton moment, which is if white supremacists have ARs and weapons and guns, and we have 400 million in the streets, why wouldn't African Americans want to have guns? Why shouldn't we have guns based on the history of gun violence used against us? And here in Central Florida, we know that we had entire communities wiped out. Had there been more guns in the hands of Black people in Ocoee in the 1920s or in Rosewood, the odds may have been different. We may have fared better. So what about the history of gun ownership and the deprivation of that right? I'll go one step further, and I want you to respond to it, which is one can argue that the right that we've had taken away from us for the longest period of time and under the most government control has been the Second Amendment as African Americans. It has not been an equal right. And in fact, it may have been a right where there's been greater deprivation than voting rights in many respects. Martin Luther King himself was a gun owner. So I'm just wondering about the response to it. How do you deal with it in such a deeply divided society where the number one terrorist threat to American national security are white supremacists?
Yeah, no, and I 100% agree. And I think, I think there's a problem in our discourse, especially in the media, on this issue, because, for instance, I think someone could look at my resume and where I've worked and assume that I believe in disarming the whole population or this and that. And to be clear, I don't believe in that, right? I don't believe in going door to door and taking people's guns. I don't believe in completely getting rid of the Second Amendment. My father's a gun owner. I mean, I come from like a military family, I've shot guns. So, for me, this is about ending gun violence. And that's why I don't really use the term gun control. It's not just a semantic thing for me. I think it's important in the integrity of like my argument and what I believe in. And I think gun control doesn't really get at what I want to do. Gun violence prevention is what I want to do. And for me, I think there's different segments of this, right? I think number one, the regulation of guns, I think it's important. It's a part of the puzzle. It's not the only piece. And I think the problem is my party, a lot of the times as Democrats, we get a little stuck on the one part that I think is important. But I believe in these common sense measures that are kind of broadly accepted. Things like universal background checks, things like ensuring that, guns just don't fall into the wrong hands at the end of the day.
What if the government is the one putting the guns into the wrong hands?
Yeah, I mean, we know from history that has happened and that is happening. And so that kind of gets to the second part that has nothing really to do with the regulation of guns, but more on the upping of our living standards. What we know to be true is, number one, most gun violence is suicide. We know that waiting day periods would slash that almost in half. But on top of that, and that comes from a psychological thing, that the longer between the decision of taking your life and having the means to take your life, you drastically impacts whether or not you're going to do it or not. So waiting day periods can really help save lives on that end. But when we talk about what's considered everyday gun violence, which is what you were just talking about, Dr. Levitt, I hate calling it that because it shouldn't be everyday gun violence, but it is. It is. Most of those are crimes of condition. People have been put in situations where they feel like using the weapon can get them ahead or solve a problem or this and that. And so for me, when you view gun violence like that, and you take a step back, ensuring everybody has healthcare helps end gun violence. Ensuring people have a dignified wage helps end gun violence. Ensuring that people have the resources they need to not be scrapping for bits and crumbs is going to help end gun violence. How can we build a world where people don't feel the need to solve their problems using a gun? And for me, that is really going to help us end gun violence as well. And it's something that's not necessarily about taking arms. And again, I think gun regulation is important. I'm not as far, I don't believe in taking guns away. I believe in gun buyback programs and stuff like that, where people can, but ensuring that we just have a better standard of living is going to help end crime in the grand scheme of things. And then the last part of it is community violence intervention. And I think this is something that I'm very passionate about, community programs that work in the community to end violence before it even happens. It's evidence-based. There's great programs across the country. One is called Life Camp in New York, run by Erica Ford, that I think is a great program. These programs don't exist everywhere. They're not funded heavily. But Congress just passed an appropriation of $5 billion to go to community violence intervention. And it's my hope that the Senate will pass it and that the president will sign it. And I want to go to Congress and fight to get that money here in Orlando. Those great programs like Guns Down, Gloves Up that, takes kids off the streets and shows them how to box, right? And not solve their problems using a gun, but boxing, right? And that art. And for me, and there's clergy programs, right, that do the same thing, after school programs. So
let me ask you this, because these are all programs that target Black and brown communities.
Yes.
They're not targeting Windermere. They're not targeting Winter Park.
No.
Now, the question then is why doesn't Winter Park have the kind of gun violence that another community might have just 4 or 5 or 6 miles away, or maybe even a half a mile away?
Yeah.
Why is that? Is it that African Americans have a natural proclivity toward crime, or is there something inherent in the way that society is structured that creates the cyclical nature of gun violence that we're not paying attention to, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, and what you just said, I think really highlights what I was saying with that middle solution of the standard of living. We could see that the standard of living in areas where there's less crime is typically higher, right? These things are directly connected. These issues are directly connected. And so for me, it's understanding how do we get more money into our communities, right? Not just violence intervention to end violence, but how are we ensuring people have the resources they need and the opportunity they need? And the thing that really gets me sometimes, and that we hear from a lot of GOP leaders a lot of the times, is they weaponize the word opportunity to not talk about the fact that not everyone has the resources to tap into opportunity. And that's something that, I really talk to my biological mother a lot about, right? And so for me, it's important that we do everything we can to really up the standard of living. That's why, when I talk about things like ensuring everybody has healthcare, ensuring everybody has not just a livable wage, but a thrivable wage, ensuring people have the protections that they need, all of this will help end gun violence in the long run.
But let's take a step back, because you talked about suicide. The number one cause of homicide in America is suicide. And when you start to look at the statistical data on that, the bulk of the suicides are not poor people. They're not fitting into that economic category that you're mentioning. I want to just throw out something and propose something different, because my experience has taught me that self-hate is the greatest cause of Black on Black crime. The fact that you could shoot your brother over stepping on your shoes, the fact that you would rob a store in your community but not another community, right? And so this question of self-esteem and motivation and pride and how you build up young men, because what we're talking about predominantly, not exclusively, is young Black and brown men. If you build them up and you love yourself, you're less likely to commit acts of violence that would put yourself in harm's way or against someone who is reflective of you. I just want your thoughts about that.
I agree. And that's why I'm for community violence intervention programs, which it's a very broad term that includes a lot of great community programs that work in broad mentorship, especially when we talk about, Black youth and Black men specifically. But, I also want to say, I agree with you, and I think we need to fund those programs, but I don't think it can be the only thing. This issue is so complicated, as you know, Dr. Levitt, that I think it's just a multi-pronged approach to solve it. And I think that's the problem with especially political discourse right now on both sides, is that people tend to paint a very specific policy prescription to solve a problem, right? And the fact of the matter is the oppression is all connected, which means the solutions have to also be connected.
I agree with you. Let's do a few rapid fire questions. Are you ready? You need to take a drink of water. I was hoping you have some wonderful libation there. There you go. You got the skill. I don't know what's in it, but I want you to enjoy it. So let's do a few things here. So I'm going to give you a series of rapid fire questions. They're single answer questions. What is your favorite food?
Rice and beans.
Rice and beans. Okay. Your favorite sports team?
Orlando Magic.
Is that political?
Growing up, it was the Miami Heat.
Okay. So your favorite sport then is basketball, or is it something else?
Yeah. Basketball is a sport I've enjoyed the most. I flirted around with a ton of different sports growing up. I was even on a golf team for a while. But basketball is where I found the most joy going to see games.
Can you play?
I cannot play basketball.
Okay, well, that's fine. You're an observer. Favorite artist?
Stevie Wonder.
Well, that's good. You got some old soul in you. Okay.
Yeah.
Favorite place where you've traveled, and where would you like to travel? What is on your bucket list?
A place I always think about, I've never been out of the country, so everyone knows I've never left the United States, but I spent a year in Charleston when I worked for the ACLU, and I love Charleston. It's one of my favorite cities I've ever been to. And I've been to I've been a lot of states here, so I would say Charleston, South Carolina.
I have a feeling that issue of you not being out of the country is going to change very quickly, like in the next 3 months. Where would you like to go? If you could go anywhere, where would it be?
I actually really, I got two. I would like to go to Japan, but I also really want to go to Lebanon, because that's a part of my identity that I don't really know anything about, to be honest. And
well, so is Haiti.
Yes, but growing up in Orlando, I've had growing up with Haitian friends, and like I've gotten bits of that culture that I didn't really grow up with many Lebanese friends. I have a Lebanese person on my staff who she has been showing me that she wants to take me to Lebanon. But I would love to go there to get in touch with those roots. I feel like those are the ones that I know the least amount.
Now you're an activist. You were certainly a leader among the cohort here in the Black Lives Matter movement. I didn't hear Africa. Why didn't I hear Africa?
I would love to go to Africa. Actually, my a good friend of mine is South African and wants to take me there as well. So yeah, I mean, there's so many places I want to go to kind of get in touch, whether it's Lebanon or Cuba, or go to Africa or go to Haiti, which we know that what's going on in Haiti right now is horrible, and our country needs to step up. Yeah, there's just so many places I want to go to, but Africa is definitely on that list. Again, I haven't been anywhere, so it's a long running list.
What is your favorite color?
I would say sky blue.
Sky blue, okay. Your favorite book?
A book I've been going back to a lot is actually Democracy Matters, by Dr. Cornel West. That's the one I've been thinking a lot about. I actually haven't read fiction in a while. I used to read a lot of fiction when I was in high school, and now it's mainly nonfiction. But I hope to get back to fiction too, because that was, it's such a, I think it's important for the soul. But yeah, I'd say Democracy Matters, because I've been questioning a lot of things, especially with January, just a lot going on, right? There's been a lot going on in our country.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful book. But you're going to Congress. There's going to be more nonfiction than fiction in your future. Trust me on that.
Yeah.
You'll squeeze in a little fiction on plane rides and when you're moving from place to place. Do you plan on getting married someday?
Do I want to get married someday?
Yes.
Yeah. I would like to get married someday.
Are you a romantic?
I am. I'm the best boyfriend in the world.
Tell me what that means in your life. What does it mean to be romantic at 25?
Yeah, well, I have a girlfriend, but I think intimacy is something that I really value, and something, sweetness and intimacy is something that I just really value, especially throughout this campaign. You're never alone in a room, but sometimes even around groups of people, you kind of feel lonely. And just kind of in your thoughts. And, sometimes your partner is kind of that one person you kind of share everything with. So that intimacy, both physically, but also both on just understanding each other in a different way, is, I think, very valuable to humanity.
From a religious standpoint, you said you were raised kind of Southern Baptist. Where do you stand on religion today? What do you identify as, if anything?
Yeah, I'm Christian. Yeah, I'm Christian. I grew up Southern Baptist. I mean, I grew up, so I was dedicated as a baby right after I was born in my church. I, grew up through a program to learn how to be a youth pastor. I taught the youth, Sunday school at my church. I played in the praise band for a decade. So I was really involved with my church. I think what I found is, when I started working on campaigns, these folks that I grew up with, Southern Baptist is different than, Black Baptist, you know what I mean? In that regard. And I grew up in kind of a whiter Southern Baptist Republican church. And so going online and seeing the pastor's son calling me the devil for working a campaign for Hillary Clinton, was startling for me. So I kind of left that church specifically and, continued, in my faith more on a personal level.
We need young leaders that can stretch across the aisle. to work with other faith communities, whatever they might be.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a historical relationship that African Americans have had. Of course, we were Christians before we landed in this country, and we were Jews, and we were Muslims, and we were polytheists, and we were all these things before landing in the Americas. But one of the core relationships that we had was with the Jewish community, and we have always been a part of the Jewish community. In fact, we might have been the founders of the Jewish community when we look at biblical history. But moving forward, there seems to be a divide between specifically Ashkenazi Jews and African Americans. And I've seen a spike in anti-Semitism among African Americans. If we look at the most recent comments of Kanye West, some of the things that Kyrie Irving has reposted. And I wanted to know your thoughts about what you're willing to do to rebuild that relationship. Now, there's some who will say we don't need to. There's a dogma with the Black Hebrew Israelites. There's a dogma with the Nation of Islam. There's a dogma with the Moorish community, all of which are a part of my community, and I have friends in all of those things. But this historic relationship between African Americans and Jews seems to be tested now more than ever. We see a spike in violence, targeting of the Jewish community. And so I just wanted to know what your thoughts are about this and what your position is on this going forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's a tragedy and it's horrible. I mean, and we've seen the rise in demonstrations of Nazis, right? Being out in public and talking about their hatred of Jewish people. We've seen even here in Central Florida, the local JCC has had a huge increase in bomb threats and death threats to the point where they've had to up security. And just today, a report came out that synagogues have seen just the increase in their threats as well. And so I think it's important as communities, and especially marginalized communities, that we really stand together. And I think, you know, for me, I think a role that I can play, especially here in Central Florida, is hopefully being able to connect not just our clergy, but also just the people and the work that we do. You know, a question that somebody asked me about a month ago at a roundtable I was doing is what can you do besides tweet, right? In this day and age. And I think conversations like this on the local level between people who are influential within the community, that's how you plant the seeds. And I think it's really important because we understand that our Jewish brothers and sisters and Black folks and Latinos and a lot of marginalized communities have been the victim of white supremacy. And figuring out the ways that we, you know, see those, the ways that it intersects with each other, I think is really important. But first and foremost is calling it out. I think that's the first step, acknowledging, and I'll continue to acknowledge it and continue to call it out. But I think the next step are those conversations, and I'm excited to have them.
What do you think about the attack in the state of Florida on what I'll just simply say is the teaching of Black history? There is a mandate under state law here to teach Black history in schools. We've had recent acts that mandate us to teach the Holocaust and teach about the Ocoee massacre, but there's almost a cognitive dissonance. So now we see an attack under the rubric of critical race theory, which no one really knows what it is except people like me who are law professors that actually invented it. Is this a code word in your view for an attack on Black history? Is it a new movement to push away what some perceive as the shaming of white men in particular, given the history of this country? I just want to know, based on your living here in the state of Florida at 25 in the CRT debate, the Stop the Woke Act, you know, where do you sit with respect to these issues?
I mean, I think what we're seeing is obviously the rise of a far right-wing fascist movement that it is on a foundation of white supremacy and on a foundation of bigotry. And we have to really call it out for what it is, because I think it's important in the next part of this conversation is talking about what are their tactics. Their tactics are fear-mongering white working class people to blame their problems on other folks, specifically Black folks. We see the same thing with queer folks and Don't Say Gay bill and different things like that. And that's been the purpose of these culture war bills, which I almost don't like to call them culture wars, because yes, it's about culture, but this will result in violence in our communities. We have to be clear. This is the teaching of our children. And when we don't confront our children with the real beginnings of this country and what that means for Black people now, what that means for white people now in our community, it creates this problem where it's a cycle of kids being surrounded in white supremacy and it being okay and it not being challenged. And I think, and you know this, Dr. Levitt, real education happens when you're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Governor DeSantis and the folks who push this bill through legislature, they say, no, it's not about getting rid of talking about slavery and the real beginnings. It's about, we don't want our kids to be uncomfortable in school. And the next question needs to be uncomfortable about what? Uncomfortable about what? And I do agree. I mean, I just, it's horrible. We have to call it out for what it is. But something I'm interested in figuring out over the coming years is, because I truly believe, as an organizer, this whole thing is about the battle of hearts and minds. And I think what we've seen is, especially with a lot of these white working class people, a lot of times, a lot of them are fluid in kind of what party they support. And I think what worries me about Trump, this new far right fascist movement, is they're indoctrinating a lot of these folks into this very radical philosophy that's based on white supremacy openly. And what I want to figure out is, how do we have meaningful conversations with folks so we can bring some folks are too far gone. We got to be clear. But so we can bring folks, especially the younger generation, into the fold of understanding how we're all part of this grand mosaic of humanity, and having those uncomfortable conversations are important so we can all thrive. And I don't know what that is. I don't have the answer, but it's something I want to figure out, because I refuse to give up on a whole slot of people, especially when we do need to build electoral power to build the world that we want.
Well, one thought is, and this is kind of a question, and I want a short answer to it because I want to follow up on it. But John Conyers for years sponsored House Bill 40 on reparations, and part of this was to study it and to use that information to educate and inform the population. I've had the opportunity to work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and oversee the process in Liberia, West Africa. We have never had a national Truth and Reconciliation commission in this country. We have commissions for everything else, but we essentially went from de jure segregation, integration, with no assistance of the government. In fact, some governments resisted it, right? We didn't have true integration really up until the late 70s and 80s in public education, for example. So do you support reparations? Have you thought about national reconciliation? And I think when we say that, we can all start in our local communities, right? Part of what the George Floyd moment did is it created that without the umbrella, right? Where we're having the kinds of conversations, we're exploring in ways that we haven't. Do you support reparations? Would you support a model of national reconciliation so we can do the very things that you're speaking about?
Yeah, I do support reparations. I supported HR 40 back then. And I do believe that we should have a national, committee of sorts to really look into it. And we have to be honest and talk with people about it. It's an uncomfortable conversation for many people. The fact is, almost every marginalized community in this country has seen some sort of reparations, but not Black folks, right? And so for me, I think it's an important one to have. And it's not enough to just talk about it in the ether. I'd like to see more action on it.
Well, certainly it was a topic of national discourse during the last election. President Biden seems to have forgotten that, quite frankly, and we need representatives to remind him of that conversation. So let me just pivot, because as we, begin to come to a close, if I'm a white male and I'm looking at America and I'm looking at the divisiveness, and I'm looking at all of the programs that are afoot, and I'm feeling as if our numbers are shrinking and that white identity is not valued. Is it fair for someone who has been generationally poor and white to live in a country where someone from Nigeria can come and immigrate to America and on day one apply for disadvantaged business status, but that poor white cannot apply for it in the same way? And this is a question of race and fairness. And it bleeds into a broader conversation of the dynamics of relations between African Americans and Caribbean folk and folks from the African continent. But just sticking on the one point, you know, Billy Bob has been generationally poor. He's third generation. And Kwaku comes in from West Africa and the next day applies for disadvantaged business tax. Is that fair to Billy Bob?
I mean, I think what's not fair to Billy Bob, to zoom out a little bit, is just the fact that he is in the situation he's in the first place. The way I like to think about fairness in terms of programs and stuff like that isn't in terms of because I got something and you didn't, my benefit should be taken away, but more as how can we help you, right? How can we help Billy Bob? I think about this in the same way as, you know, the cancellation of student debt and when, you know, the question of fairness around that. And so, I mean, I think it's important. We have enough resources in this country to make sure that Billy Bob and, you know, Kwaku can have the resources they need. But we go through a system where we're thought to believe that those resources don't exist or that they're scarce. And the fact of the matter is the top, you know, 0.0% of this 0.1% of this country owns more than the bottom 50%. And I think that's always an important thing to keep in mind. We're closer to being homeless than we are to being Jeff Bezos, right? And I think sometimes folks lose sight of that.
Well, listen, I know you have a hard stop, and I want to honor your schedule. We're running right up to the dial of the hard stop. I want to just say thank you on behalf of those who have tuned in. You have some great influencers, by the way, that have tuned into this webinar. I appreciate you being candid, and I appreciate the answers, and we wish you Godspeed going forward. This has been a Candid Conversation with Maxwell Frost. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Levitt. Thank y'all for joining. I put my email in the chat. If any of y'all want to connect or here locally, please feel free to send me an email or get my information. Dr. Levitt, my website is also in the chat. Y'all have a blessed day.
Thank you.